With the reveal of Civilization 7, there are so many questions and concerns, and one of the biggest changes so far is ages, how eras and ages work in Civilization 7, and people are freaking out. And although ages are different, it's not quite as crazy as it first appears. Initially, it sounds way messier than how Civ 6 and Civ 5 worked, but once you put it all together, there seems to be a core idea tying everything together. So first of all, ages are longer. They're more distinct, but overall the whole game takes about as long as a normal Civ game usually takes. So although each individual age is gonna be longer, and it feels like the game is split up into 3 sections, the overall Civ game is still a Civ game. They're just splitting it to 3 phases: Antiquity, Exploration, and Modern. One, to sort of define the game a bit more into chapters. Each full Civ game is gonna be 3 big chapters, which makes it easier to get into the chapter, sort of complete the chapter, and then maybe just have that sort of break in the story in your head. So you can say, oh, the Antiquity age was all about this, the Exploration age was all about this, and the Modern age was all about that. And that sort of organizes the game a bit better, because Civ games just traditionally can be convoluted and just messy and all over the place, right? But how do these ages actually work? So first of all, the big point that sort of kicks this off is that your leader will stay the same with their bonuses as you go through the game. Leaders themselves can level up and gain new passives and abilities and stuff like that, but generally your leader is going to stay the same. So if you are Hatshepsut, you are Hatshepsut. And before anyone asks, the outfits do not change. Fortunately or unfortunately, based on what you like. If you're a Civ 3 fan, I'm sorry. You're not gonna see all the leaders turn into suits into the modern age. They're gonna stay looking the way they do with their outfits. And some people like this, some people don't. Which one do you prefer? But another big point is that your leader is not tied to your civilization. And this drove a lot of people crazy, because they're like, what? I could be Hatshepsut leading the Mongols? Like, this is crazy. But I was playing through the older Civ games recently, and I want to point out that this isn't new to the Civ series. Civilization 4, I loaded it up just today to start up a new game, and I noticed there was an option that allowed you to not tie your leader to their natural civilization. You could pick any leader with any Civ, and you could do that in Civ 4. So this idea is not new, but this is the first time where it's basically compulsory, right? You have to have your leader lead another civilization, because your leader is going to stay the same, but as you go through the ages, your civilization is going to change. And this is where things get, let's say, interesting. So each age, Antiquity, Exploration, and Modern, there are different civs in each age. You can start out as the Ancient Egyptians, but you're not going to be the Ancient Egyptians in the Exploration and Modern age. Your civ is going to have to change, even though your leader stays the same. Now, there are natural pathways for your civilization. So for example, what they've shown so far is Egypt can transition into Songhai, and then they transition into Buganda. And that's always going to be available. And that sort of makes narrative sense, it makes historical sense, because things sort of change. And there was, I did have the idea that you could do 3 Egypts, right? You could have ancient Egypt into the Ayyubid dynasty, into the Republic of Egypt. But, you know, with a civilization game, you're gonna be limited to how many civilizations there are, especially on launch day. So although it is possible sometime in the future to have Egypt through the 3 ages, at least at launch, you're gonna have to change civilization. But there's always a natural, more historically accurate option that is always open, right? So for another example, you could start as ancient Rome and then go into Norman and then go into England, right? That sort of makes sense, right? However, it has to be said that you can go for more wacky options, but you have to sort of work for it. So for example, you can go from Egypt to Mongols, but you can only unlock the Mongols that way if you mass horses, right? So although you can go for more unorthodox civilization transitions, it's not gonna come out of nowhere. It has to make narrative sense to the game you're playing. And this is something that a lot of people struggled with Humankind, where, oh, you're playing the ancient Egyptians, and now you're the Celts, and then you're the Mongolians, and then you're United States, right? It just sort of jumped around everywhere, and people were thrown off. They felt disconnected from the game. And transitioning from age to age and constantly switching civilizations, it felt really weird. So this way, if you want to go from Egypt to Mongolia, then you have to basically play like Mongols, right? While you are ancient Egypt, you have to go for cavalry, amass horses, unlock Mongols narratively, and then you could transition into them. But not just by default. By default, Egypt becomes Songhai. Okay? Okay, so there's some restrictions which sort of make sense. Also, as you transition from age to age, you'll be picking legacy Civ traits. These are bonuses and additions, and they're not finalized, and of course through Civilization games history, they always change the bonuses and stats and abilities and all of that through development over the expansions and all of that. So none of this is set in stone. Even after release, it's not set in stone, but there will be legacy Civ traits, so when you transition from one age to the next, you'll get certain bonuses that will give your civilization a boost that you bring along with you. Because the whole underlying idea here is that your civilization builds upon itself in layers. So as you go through the game, you're building up and building up and building up, not just your cities, but your civilization itself is building up on top of itself in layers. So in terms of how age transitions work, so first of all, they go through phases, and we've seen that it goes from the age begins, and that goes on for a while, and then a crisis begins, and the crisis intensifies, and then the crisis culminates, and then you transition into the next age. This is sort of like, you know, in Civ 6, there's era score. As you do certain things, it pushes the era forward. But this is a bit more structured, right? So as you go through your era or the age and progress through it, you build up towards that transition. And this time we've seen that there's 4 different ways of pushing your age forward. There's the science, culture, military, and economic quests that you can go on and accomplish. And you get points for accomplishing those quests in these 4 areas: science, culture, military, and economic. And what we've seen is that you can get up to 3 points in each area, and you can trigger a golden age for that area. And the exact specifics of how those bonuses work, they're not fully confirmed, and they could change over time, so we don't need to get into that. But the actual fundamental mechanic here is that you accomplish these quests because you want to move on to the next age, but in the best way possible. So do you want to beeline it in one area, or do you want to spread it out across the 4 and maybe get no golden ages? So this sort of makes it that each age is sort of like a mini Civ game with their own mini victory conditions, right? There's these 4 possible mini victories in each age. And that lends itself to that idea where the game is split into these 3 big chapters. There's even like a beginning, middle, and end for each age. Now, it does have to be said that as you trigger the crisis begins and the crisis intensifies, you will be forced to pick crisis policy cards, which makes things worse for you. And this is sort of an interesting idea because we don't usually see these sorts of mandatory negatives in game design. And it'll be interesting to see how this works out. But basically, as your age begins to culminate towards the end, you get these crisis policy cards and you have to choose what negative effect that you want for the end of this era. And it has been said that the specific elements of the crises are still being worked on, and they'll likely tie into narrative events, which trigger events and choices for you to make as you go through the game. Also, as expected, as you progress into the next age, it will unlock the new technologies and civics in those following ages. And we have also seen that each particular civilization has their own unique civics that will go along with them, and you can progress through sort of a sub-civics tree based on which civilization you pick. And your cities progressing through the ages, there's this concept of overbuilding. You know how, for example, old ancient cities, like modern Rome, if you dig down, they're still finding things underneath modern Rome from ancient Rome, and this idea of overbuilding, of building on top of the ruins of the past, is what they're going for with cities as you go through the ages. You build on top of old obsolete things with new modern things. As a side note, they have also said that the trade system is going to be different in all 3 ages. So how you trade with other civilizations is going to change from age to age. And from what we've seen of independent factions. So in older Civ games, we've had barbarians. Sometimes they've just been sort of everywhere randomly, like in Civ 1 and Civ 2. Sometimes they've been more structured, like city-states or little barbarian camps, like we've seen in Civ 5 and Civ 6. This time, they're combining barbarians and city-states into independent factions, and as they start and begin to pop up, they're sort of like barbarians in older Civ games, but as the game goes on, they grow into city-states, which you can then deal with diplomatically or militaristically. So this is something that actually a lot of people have been asking for a while, is that these barbarians and city-states, barbarians should be able to become their own faction or city-state, and they don't become as expansive as an actual player, but we can see these independent loose factions form into their own established areas. And actually a lot of people have been asking for that, and seeing these grow through the ages is going to be quite interesting. Overall, every change that Civilization 7 is making, from eras to ages, it's around this core idea of having a lot of changes happen, but making sense around a story that you are telling with your civilization. The big concern with the changes for ages in Civ 7 is that it's just going to be messy and nonsensical and pull you out of the game. But what they're trying to go for is to actually pull you further into the game, bringing you into the story more. And it seems to be a conflict of ideas, you know? Changing civilizations through the game sounds like it's gonna take you out, but they're trying to find a natural pathway where even though you're changing civilizations, you still feel like the same civilization, because you don't just change for no reason. You change for specific things that happened in the game. You amass certain resources, you achieve certain objectives, you hit certain crises that narratively make sense to what you're doing in the game. And whether they can pull this off or not remains to be seen, but the idea is that these changes happen because of very clear reasons, and it overall tells a more interesting story. And that sounds amazing, but how it works in practice can be an absolute mess. And this is something that I want to posit to all of you, where the ideas can sound good or bad when you first hear of them. Like, oh, you're gonna change Civ in every age. That sounds terrible. But if you pause and think of it, you can immediately think of how that can be bad and just unfun. But before judging it right now, we should sort of consider, is there a version of that that is actually good and fun? Changing civs in each age is not an inherently bad idea. We're just sort of used to seeing bad implementations, and we're reasonably very concerned or just dismissive of the idea because we've not seen it work really well. Now, Civ 7 has put itself the challenge of making this work really well. Whether they do it, that is another thing entirely. But the idea now seems to make sense now that we've seen more details and all of that. But what do you think? Good points, bad points? What do you want? What do you want to change? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and found this useful. I did cover Civ 6 extensively back in the day, and I'd love to cover Civ 7 as well. Thank you so much for liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.